In local news, a new crime wave that is sweeping Detroit has already claimed the lives of 21 police officers.
Disturbance? I'm a big fan. Now move!
Can you fly?
What the hell is this? Where is all the money?
We all saw it hesitate in a life and death situation. Why?
Listen, I would trust this guy with my kids. I mean, if I had any. This was just an isolated glitch.
Dead or alive, you are coming with me.
Robocop. Who is he? What is he? Where does he come from? He is OCP's newest soldier in their revolutionary crime management program. OCP spokesman claimed that the Fearless Machine has crooks on the run in Old Detroit. Today, kids at Lee Iacocca Elementary School got to meet in person what their parents only read about in comic books.
Serve the public trust, protect the innocent, uphold the law. Robocop.
So, after 20 years, or it will be 20 years, next summer, June 2023, we will see the release of Robocop Rogue City. And it's the first time that we've seen Robocop in his own game. A couple of appearances in games like Mortal Kombat 11 aside, and a couple of very dodgy mobile games. This will be the first time since Robocop 2003, which was released for the Xbox and PlayStation 2 and Windows systems at the time. And with the amount of hype that this game has been receiving, based on nostalgia and how good it looks, I thought this was the perfect time to look back at Robocop, the arcade game. Now, this game was released way back in 1988, a year after the film came out, and it was a huge success at the time. Now, as you can hear, this game contains so many things that were unheard of at the time in 1988. We had the Basil Polidoris score actually brought into the game. They did a great job in bringing in a chiptune version of it that you can hear now, along with actual samples from the film's actual dialogue for Robocop and Ed 209, etc. A lot of the sound effects were just taken straight from samples that the team over at Data East had gotten from the filmmakers themselves. They'd been able to get Orion to send over copies. It didn't have the whole film, but they were able to take enough clips, which is why you'll see a lot of this game. The stages are very reminiscent of the film, but they look the same, but they're not exactly in specific order. For example, we've gone from the streets of Detroit to the old area where Robocop first goes on patrol, in the classic scene where he deals justice to a couple of rapists. This is what this scene is based on, but then they do take a few liberties, but considering they didn't have all the information, they did a very good job. Now, the home versions of this game were also very, very well received as well. The home computers at the time Spectrum and Commodore, although the Commodore had a few very well-known glitches, including game-breaking glitches where you can actually progress past the warehouse level. Unfortunately, due to unrealistic time constraints and a bug where you can actually progress, it kind of meant that the game was completely busted beyond belief. And yet, despite that, the game spent a record number of weeks at the top of the charts on both the Commodore 64 and the Spectrum. Now, this arcade conversion is fantastic. I don't know how many of you remember playing this in the arcade at the time, but it certainly did gobble up the coins at the time. It was very, very difficult. First couple of stages we got through here now just about okay. Obviously this is on emulation, unfortunately don't have the original. As due to licensing laws, it's never really been re-released at the time. Now here you see one of the bonus stages. This was kind of a thing around the time. I know in Shinobi and Shadow Dancer there were similar things where you could get extra lives in bonus stages between levels. With this one, this was actually the only way you could replenish your life bar between levels. It didn't refill automatically between levels as we get a lot nowadays, and you had to get obviously as many hits as possible in this training stage, shooting range, in order to replenish as much health as possible. If you manage to get 100%, you can see here I only got 90%. It's very difficult, but if you could get 100%, it would actually extend your life bar, so you'd have a larger life, or as you can see, as it was called at the time, power bar. But yeah, you can see there it says not too bad, obviously encouraging you to get that 100%. And here's where we came onto what was really the difficult stages in the arcades. From here, the game would suffer from a lot of flicker on screen with too many sprites, and especially when a lot of enemies are on screen firing projectiles, it would get increasingly more difficult to try and keep up. And you're probably going to start seeing some deaths in the near future too. They did very well, including the weapons. I love the fact that they've got the 50 cal sniper's rifle in here from the film. The one that Clarence and his team obviously used trying to take out Robocop at the big end fight at the steel mill. But as you can see here, it's not the most responsive game, but given the fact that how clunky Robocop actually was, and I suppose is meant to be, really, that was the whole point, which I think is another reason why people weren't big fans of the 2014 reboot, which didn't really reboot the franchise at all. It kind of came and went, but it made the game a lot more difficult. But graphically, you can see at the time, can you consider the other games that were huge the year that this came out, the likes of Hang On, Double Dragon 2, this was just before the Turtles came out. Now unfortunately this didn't make any top grossing lists outside of Hong Kong as an arcade coin-op, mostly due to the fact that it came out in November, so unfortunately it had that crossover of not being out too much in 1988 to dominate the charts everywhere, and obviously having that spread over 88 and 89 means obviously other games came out in 1989 that kind of took its crown, such as the aforementioned Ninja Turtles. And here's where you really see difficulties in the game. Even though it's a great game, like I say, the sound, the samples it uses, the graphics were miles ahead of pretty much everything else at the time. But this is where you start to see a lot of flicker and slow down as we get more and more enemies on screen, especially with projectiles. And this is the level that on the Commodore 64 is where you would have the grain-breaking bug. Now, as was the style at the time, we all know how much of a quarter muncher these games were made to be. I know a lot of people complain about how unfair games are these days with microtransactions, but believe me, back in these days, the arcade games were just as unfair because they wanted as many of your quarters as possible. They wanted to make it just easy enough in those early levels, just to get you hooked, so that you wanted to see how far the game progressed and take it from there. And they certainly managed to get that balance just about right in this game. If the arcade had it set too hard in the difficulty settings, then obviously that would have affected it negatively. So I think most arcades kept it on normal, from word that I've certainly seen online. Admittedly, this is all speculation and hearsay, and a lot of anecdotal evidence. We don't have any facts to support that, but certainly when you can see how many deaths we get just on this run, you can see that any harder difficulty would have probably made it too difficult. And certainly the Ocean team who dealt with the home conversions of this, obviously this is Data East who were subcontracted to deal with the arcade version by Ocean Software, but Ocean Software had to tweak the difficulty on the home versions because it was a lot of people complained that it was too difficult. And you can see I certainly don't have the skills that I mean, I was never a 1/4 king back in the day. I could never do this on just one playthrough. I'd have to take a good few goes to get through. Obviously completely out of time now. Forgotten a lot of the techniques that I used to use to get through the game in as little quarters as possible. Or 20p's as the case would be back in the UK. But you can see here, as we've certainly gone through different stages of the game, and we've gone through different stages of the film. We went straight from old Detroit over to a steel mill, and now we're going to the OCP building. From what I can gather, the scenes that they were given included the police shootout. It didn't include the Dick Jones and Ed 209 fight, which is why, even though we do see Ed 209 in this game several times as a boss, pretty much the only boss really, alongside Clarence Bodica's van, we don't actually see that level played out. They could have made a few different choices. We could have seen maybe a nightclub scene. Obviously that was where Robocop captures Leon Nash. We don't really get a good drug lab scene, which is probably the most iconic scene from the movie. Unfortunately we don't get that. We get a kind of similar... every interior is pretty much the same. It all kind of looks like the warehouse, so unfortunately there's not too much. And this is where the game really veers off. We get guys with jetpacks, we get turrets, and it becomes increasingly difficult from this point forward. Certainly it was in the arcade to progress without using several continues and more quarters, because as you will see, the flicker and the slowdown gets absolutely ridiculous. I mean, we've died here once again. We're just going to continue again now. But even though it was a short game, I mean, obviously at the time it felt a lot longer, because most games, you go back to any game that came out around this era and you would find that they were very short. Because whilst they wanted to take as many of your quarters as possible, they also wanted to get you gone and the next person on. So that's why you wouldn't find many games that would take longer than, say, I don't know, half an hour at best, to keep those lines down and to keep those revenues in. But here you can see we're starting to get more people on the screen, more bullets, more projectiles, and whilst I'm sure some people can probably still go through this only on 1/4, it's certainly nothing that I can do. But yeah, it is fantastic to see. One of the 4 Titans. I'm going to be doing a series of retrospectives looking over the kind of the 4 kings, as it were, of science fiction from the 80s, starting here with Robocop, due to Rogue City's announcement and trailer coming out next year. But obviously at the time, you think back, you had the four, what I would consider the four titans of science fiction from that era. Certainly people of a similar age as myself would probably agree. Robocop, Terminator, Alien, Predator. And all of them, I think you can see a lot of that is reflected in the games that are being made at the moment, with nostalgia being such a big money spinner at the moment. You can see a lot of people are bringing back the properties that they enjoyed, enjoying as a child. So you're seeing like the likes of Alien, Fireteam Elite. We saw Predator Hunting Grounds. There's a new Terminator game in the works, not to mention all the films. At the time of recording, the new Predator movie, Prey, is going to be coming out this week on Disney Plus and Hulu, depending on what territory you're in, whether you're US, UK. And so a series of retrospectives I think is quite fitting, looking back at how many games media we had for all of these properties. Obviously there were some inevitable crossovers, Robocop himself having several in different media. In the comics he had absolutely loads at the time. Even in games we had Robocop versus Terminator, which we'll come to in due course. But as the first one, this certainly stood out, and I think that the success of the game, almost as much as the success of the film itself, helped to establish Robocop as a viable franchise, which led to the sequels. The amount of money that the game made, both in the arcades and on the home consoles, was amazing. And I think the fact that, again, it showed off the power of the systems, which hadn't really been utilised to full effect at that time. But to get full, voice clips and samples and such a musical score, we did see it, I guess, very soon after, with Michael Jackson's Moonwalker by Sega, using samples from the artist himself as well as songs from Michael Jackson. But it was something that certainly you went into an arcade back in the late 80s, early 90s, and it was something that stood out a mile away. Even before you saw it, you could hear that Robocop, and you'd hear the voice samples. Obviously they would pump the volume up on this probably higher than other games, but it was one of the most iconic sounds of the arcade in the late 80s and early 90s, along with the old elephants from Street Fighter 2 Dowsum stage. It was one of the few sounds that you would hear over and over again, and that certainly helped to make it stand out and become a big seller. But as you can see here, now that we've gotten onto the later levels, and due to the fact that they didn't have too many scenes to go from, is where they really used their artistic license and just built Omni Consumer Products to be this big high-tech lab with gun turrets on every floor. But it was never really an issue at the time. I think a lot of people understood that whilst the film itself was certainly, at the time, it was one of those films that even though it was rated 18 in the UK. I'm not sure if it was NC-17 or what the equivalent is at R for a 15, I think, in America. I'm not sure the ratings over there, but it was one of those films that everyone saw, regardless of how old you were. Even though no one was 18, everyone had seen this film. And admittedly, obviously on TV we got the heavily censored cut down versions, which were literally about 70 minutes, with people being called pansies, etc., due to the old BBFC saying what could and couldn't be said and shown on TV at the time. But everyone knew what Robocop was, and again, this I think also really helps with the heavy push of marketing and toys and cartoons that led to it. Much like all the other properties that we've mentioned, like Alien, Terminator, etc., that all got comics, cartoons, merchandising lines based on the properties that sold exceptionally well back then. But you can see here, once again we're faced Ed 209s, different versions maybe, different colours and different weapon sets, but essentially still the same end boss, which is one of the few sort of problems with the game, rather than having different bosses. It would have been nice if we'd have had a like a gas station level, and you know, we could have had a meal on his motorbike as an end level boss. That would have been cool. But like I say, given the fact that they didn't have access, the team at Data East didn't have access to the whole film, they were only given or sent select scenes from the movie in order to base a game from. I think they did as well as possible. But you can see here, this is where it starts getting exceedingly cheap, and unless you had the game memorized, it was very difficult to get through. And I'm surprised that we haven't gone through more continues than we have already. But it does literally become pretty much a bullet hell at this stage. And one thing I will say is that even though they didn't have the whole movie, and even though they had to make up a lot of the enemies and the stages themselves, the level of detail for everything that they were able to take from the film is so high. Like I said before, obviously the sound effects and the samples they took straight from the movie, which is why you do have Peter Weller's voice. And it's great to see in Rogue City that he is reprising his role as Robocop. I think we all would have hoped that they would have gone with that, and luckily they have. But even the other touches, like the sound effects when Robocop holsters and unholsters his gun, the actual sound that his gun makes when firing, it's all, you know, very much movie accurate. And again, bring up the score as well, because I think at the time, you look at similar video game scores around the same time, and even the home versions, even though the tune is not the Basil Polidorus score, Jonathan Dunn did a fantastic job with his own understated theme for the home computer versions, which again garnered critical and commercial acclaim, and was used again in the Game Boy version, and then was used in an Ariston advert, and yeah, it did exceptionally well. So not only was this game hugely influential, it was also inspirational as well, because it led to other things, with people utilising, you know, obviously Jonathan Dunn utilising the home computers to the best of their abilities at the time, given they were 8-bit home systems, so you didn't exactly have a lot of power. And again, being on cassette tape as things were back in the day, it was very difficult to get high quality sound in games. Obviously this being the arcade was slightly different, it being on its own motherboard, so it did have the advantage there, which is why we get such a fantastic score. They really did a great job. Can't overstate that enough. And as you can see, here we are, we're coming up on the very end, and you can see that they've even brought in the scale model that's in the boardroom scene, the iconic Ed 209 boardroom scene. You can see the lovely scale model of Delta City in the background there. And here we go. So unfortunately, even though Dick Jones is there holding the president, we have to fight yet another Ed 209. The only difference this one for the final Ed 209 is he has the rockets, although they're coming out from the top, so I'm not sure if they just ad-libbed that because obviously the rockets from the actual film, it was a side attachment to the machine gun arm that he fired from. But that's that. That's our, I think, 5th and final Ed 29. And you can even see here, you can see the briefcase where the gun is kept in the meeting room.
Thank you for your cooperation.
Great little touch, absolutely fantastic little touch. And then again, you get the end scene where he says, like, unfortunately you don't see it, but it's shown there. So that was Robocop Arcade. Absolute classic game from 1988, one that certainly changed the way a lot of video games were done, especially movie tie-ins. I think the quality of licensed games, certainly, even though Ocean Software were very, very much come under fire in later years for some of their later and sloppier and lazier productions, were certainly given a lot of credit because of the hard work that they put in acquiring this license and their home conversions. But this Data East version, absolutely amazing. Big part of everyone's childhoods, and I hope you enjoyed this trip down memory lane, revisiting Robocop Arcade, and hopefully you'll enjoy the series as we continue on and look at further entries in the series. But until next time, take care for now. Thanks for watching.